right. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Government officials, dignitaries, donors, supporters, our host, moderators, panelists, friends, and fools. My name is Ophelia Ines Weeks. I serve as Executive Director of the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Center for Women and Development. I invite you to visit our website on a regular basis to learn more about the center at www.ejscenter.org. We have many engaging activities and information, including information about job opportunities that will capture your interest. As well, later this year, we will begin a capital campaign, and we'll have information about that we hope will allow us to build our physical space. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to this forum on mapping progress in Liberia with reference to the 2020 Ibrahim Index of African Governance. This forum is sponsored by the EJS Center, and I'd like to thank one of the center's most committed sponsors, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, through its executive director, Madam Nathalie de la Palme, for being so readily available and helpful when we reached out to them. Special thanks also to Onyeka Wabunia, Kristen Ahmed Jamel, and Olivia Ryan. The idea of this forum evolved during a casual conversation with Madam Sirleaf, when the question was raised about how one brings such important information like the Ibrahim Index of African Governance to the ordinary citizen. The original idea was for this to be an in-person forum in Liberia, but COVID-19 restrictions nixed that. And so we turned lemons into lemonade by hosting this virtual event, which now boasts an even wider audience. In addition, long after this event is over, the forum will be available on YouTube and on our website. The hosts and panelists are all Liberians, and the moderators include some non-Liberians. This forum, with its 4 panels, promises to be a fantastically dynamic, informative, and educative discussion, and I suspect it will also be quite spirited. So without further ado, allow me to introduce the host of the day, Counselor Seward Montgomery Cooper, an international and corporate lawyer who heads the Cooper and Company law firm. He serves as one of 7 international judges of the World Bank Administrative Tribunal and served as the founding EJS Center board chair. Counselor Cooper, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weeks. Thank you very much. I'm honored to serve as host for this event. Defining governance as the province of political, social, and economic public goods and services that every citizen has the right to expect from their government, and that a government has the responsibility to deliver to its citizens. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation's Ibrahim Index of African Governance, the IIAG, which has been published consistently since 2007, assesses the governance performance in 54 African countries and is the most comprehensive data set measuring African governance. The results of the 2020 IIAG is recognized as the most up-to-date baseline of the current challenges facing good governance in Africa. The index assesses governments on their delivery of public goods and services in 4 categories: security and the rule of law, participation, rights and inclusion, foundations for economic opportunity, and human development. Each of these categories will be the theme of one of 4 panel discussions held throughout the Mapping Progress in Liberia event. It's delightful to see the level of interest and support for this event, as evidenced by the participation of distinguished members of Liberian society, members of government, including members of President's cabinet, both present and past, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Liberia, academia, the private business sector, and civil society. Your presence speaks to the willingness of all to engage in positive and constructive discussions that acknowledge the strengths and deficits in governance. Thank you very much, because it is these exchanges of candid, constructive, positive ideas that help to move a society forward. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation's head of research, Camilla Roca, and senior researcher, Ines Schultes, will be providing an overview of Liberia's results in all 4 of the categories mentioned above. I would just point out that with respect to Camilla Roca, she's head of research at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, where she leads on the foundation's analysis and publications on African governance. Her main interest is the African political, economic, and social landscape, with a focus on the nexus between fragility, development, and state-society relations. She has extensive work experience in Africa and in the EU. She holds 2 master's degrees from the College of Europe and the University of Padua, and several professional certificates. Ines Schultes is a senior researcher at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, where she works on producing analyses and publications on African governance. Her main interests are the rule of law, rights, democracy, and security landscape of the African continent. She is educated in Sweden at Uppsala University and also at University of Mannheim. So I invite them to please give us a summary of the key elements of the research work that has been done.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Camilla, and I will deliver a quick introduction and presentation alongside my colleague Ines, as just explained. First of all, let me just say from the side of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, a wholehearted thank you for the invitation. As the team responsible for the production of the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, we are extremely honored to participate to this unique opportunity for dialogue and exchange with the key policymakers involved in bringing change and the day-to-day government work within Liberia. We are looking forward to a constructive dialogue, and we are here also to answer any questions from the audience as well about the index, about our methodology, and about the way we build this tool to measure governance. I will provide you with a very quick introduction to the methodology and the sort of behind the scene of the index, and then my colleague Ines will take you through the specific results of the index concerning Liberia and the security and rule of law findings. If you allow me, I will just put up a presentation that will help us sort of run through. I hope you can all see it. First of all, as was already perfectly explained by our moderator, MIF definition of governance is a definition that puts citizens at the heart of the relationship between state and their constituencies. As you can see here, governance for the Moi Brain Foundation definition is the provision of political, social, and economic goods that citizens have the right to expect from their state, and states have the responsibility to deliver to citizens. According to this definition, the index, the Moi Brain Index of African Governance, was created in 2007 to provide a tool to assess governance progress on the African continent. If we look at how the index is built, basically what is the journey of data points for the index, we can see that it spans from what we call the selection of sources all the way to consultation, collection, calculation, and final results. First of all, and this is a question that we are often asked, how do we select the sources for the index? The index as a data project has a very solid statistical methodology that also applies to the selection of the sources. Once we have identified our governance proxies and therefore the pillars that build the index framework, today, for instance, we will look at the results for the 4 categories of the index. For all these governance proxies, basically, we have a selection criteria that each source to be covered in the index needs to cover for at least 33 of 54 African countries. And this is important because the index is supposed to provide an assessment of governance that is comparable across 54 African countries, but also relevant and recent data. And here you can see the criteria to make sure that the amount of estimated data is reduced to the minimum, and we also include recent data within the last 3 years. 90% of the index indicators are clustered, therefore 90% of these governance measures are based on more than a variable or more than a source, which means that they are stronger as indicators of governance, as they do focus and they do sort of provide a picture based on more than a variable or a source. This is a little bit visual representation of what is the final steps of the journey of a data point. Various sources do present different scales of assessment. The index includes more than 40 sources. All these sources are normalized and then aggregated into the different categories, subcategories, and the overall governance score. Looking into the continental level, I wanted to provide you a little bit of the background against which we will analyze Liberia's results. Looking back within the decade under analysis by the 2020 IBRAM Index of African Governance, we can see that the continent has certainly progressed in overall governance, and we have more than half of African citizens are living in 2019 in a country where governance has improved since 2010, and we need to take stock of this progress. However, this graphic explains how this progress has actually taken 2 different paths. On the one hand, certainly progress driven by good results in economic opportunity, human development, health, education, and so on. However, progress being held back substantially by declines in security and rule of law and participation rate and inclusion. And what is important to note is that at least 20 countries in Africa, representing at least 42% of Africa's population, have gone through this increasing sort of improvement at the same time as the increasing deterioration that you see here. And this is like an important context against which to assess the Liberia results that Ines will now take you through. Thank you so much. Ines, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. Let me share. Okay, so these are the results for Liberia for all the 4 categories plus the overall governance level. So what we see here, so Liberia scores, could you go to the other slide, please, Camilla, the one before? So Liberia scores about like 47.9 out of 100, which means it's ranked kind of more or less directly in the middle of the ranking table at 27th in overall governance in 2019. Since 2010, Liberia has improved its overall governance score and its performance, but it is kind of showing some warning signs because between 2015 and 2019, the score has declined again. And this is one of the largest declines in this time period on the continent. So as we can see, the highest scoring, so what we can see, so why do we see this? So the progress over the decade for Liberia has really been driven by actually 3 of the 4 categories. So we see the most has been in human development, for which Liberia also managed to kind of sustain the progress over the last 5 years, like during the mid-period as well. It even got a bit quicker. But we still see that Liberia still ranks like 43rd on the continent for human development, but it's still very good progress. We've also seen progress in the areas of security and rule of law, which we'll discuss shortly, as well as in foundations for economic opportunity. However, we do see that for both of these, again, we see there's been like a decline since 2015 and 2019. So the score in 2015 was higher than it was in 2019, although compared to 10 years ago, the situation has improved. One area that is quite concerning is participation rights and inclusion, which has declined since 2010 as well. So if we dig a bit deeper in security and rule of law, which is the theme of this panel, this again has 4 subcategories. And we see in 3 of them, we've made quite good progress, most of it in accountability and transparency, but also security and safety has been quite a success story. And also rule of law and justice, we've seen a slight improvement of plus 0.8. However, we also see this progress made in security and safety has been slowing down since 2015. And in rule of law, it even has, again, kind of declined between 2015 and 2019. The really worrying story here in this category is anti-corruption. So we see there's been a very small decline since 2010. However, if we go a bit deeper into kind of the different time periods, we see that between 2015 and 2019, Liberia is the most declined country on the continent for the subcategory. And the drop in score has resulted in Liberia dropping from being among the top 10 scorers for this subcategory to now ranking 35th in 2019. So why is this the case? So if we look at kind of the indicators for this subcategory, which are here, so we see good progress has been made, for example, in the absence of anti-influence on government, which has been driving the success story in accountability and transparency. Absence of forced migration has made progress. Liberia is scoring very highly on this indicator as well. Public procurement procedures is a success story over the decade as well. If we then go in and see what is driving kind of the declines since 2010, we see there's less executive compliance with the rule of law, an increase in human trafficking and forced labor, but also corruption in the private sector and the public sector, and also less institutional checks and balances. When we then again, so this table shows you the declines between 2010 and 2019. If we then, for example, go deeper into the timeline, again, 2015 to 2019, we see public procurement procedures, which has kind of lost a lot of its progress it made up to 2015 in then the later half of the period, for example. So these are the main areas of concern for Liberia, although there's been plenty of success stories, as you can see on the left-hand side as well. So looking forward to hear about the discussion from the panelists of these results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ines and Camila. Now, our first panel, appropriately so, will be dealing with the matters of security and the rule of law. And I say appropriately so because in the absence of security and the rule of law, little else is achievable in any society. Our moderator for this panel is Dr. Funmi Olonisakin, who is Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's College, London, University of London. She founded the African Leadership Center, which aims to build the next generation of African scholars and analysts generating cutting-edge knowledge for peace, security, and development in Africa. She was director of the Conflict, Security, and Development Group at King's College London from 2003 to 2013. And prior to this, she worked in the Office of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. By the mere fact that I mentioned that she's a professor, you know that she has the requisite academic qualifications and experience suitable for this particular task. So let me welcome the Professor. The floor is yours for this very important and initial element of our discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Councillor Cooper. Thank you for your eloquent introduction, your excellent chairing of this session, and thank you to our colleagues at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. I want to thank Dr. Weeks for making this opportunity possible. As you said, you have turned lemon to lemonade, and that has enabled some of us to participate in this event. I'm really grateful for that. So let me now say without further ado how we will structure the rest of the process. We will listen to our eminent panelists, and I shall introduce them before they speak. And I think I shall do the 4 introductions now so that I'll call upon them, not in the same sequence because we have structured this to deal with certain thematic issues in order. I would therefore proceed to fire the first round of questions in conversation with the panelists, and then we'll open it up for discussion. But I intend to bring this to a close precisely at the time that Onyeka had instructed me to do. So let's move on with this conversation. As I said, let me introduce the panelists in this order. We have Justice Gloria Musu-Scott. I would not read their entire biographies. These are eminent panelists. I just want to give a touch. I just want to touch on some of the experiences that they have for those who have not yet met them. Justice Musu-Scott became Liberia's second female Chief Justice following Councillor Francis Johnson Allison. She was educated at the University in Liberia, where she received a bachelor's degree in economics with a minor in management and bachelor's degree of law from the Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law. She worked as a prosecutor at the Ministry of Justice in '91, was appointed as Assistant Minister of Justice. She's been a judge for the monthly and probate court in Montserrado County, and she was counselor at law of the Supreme Court Bar in 1992, and so on. But I think it's important to say that following the 1997 elections and the restoration of the Constitution, Councillor Scott was then appointed Chief Justice for the Supreme Court of the Republic of Liberia from '97 until 2003. So you can imagine that she's eminently qualified to speak to these questions of security and the rule of law. In 2005, she became Senator for Maryland County in the general elections. In 2012, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf appointed her chairperson of the Constitution Review Committee due to her previous experience in legal action. Our second panelist, Councillor T. Negbalee Warner, I will refer to him as Dean Warner from now on. He's a Liberian lawyer with more than 20 years of experience as a practicing lawyer, including 13 years of teaching law. Councillor Warner is currently the Dean of the Louis Arthur Grant School of Law in the University of Liberia and the Senior Partner of Heritage Partner and Associates law firm located in Monrovia as well. Dean Warner holds a BSc in Economics, an LLB from the University of Liberia, as well as an LLM from Cornell Law School. He's also a member of the Liberian National Bar Association and the New York Bar Association. Followed by, I would now introduce Councillor Dr. Yvette Chesson-Wureh. I smile because I think to some of us at King's College London, she needs no introduction, given the kinds of collaboration we had with her in the past. One of our fellows still speaks of her experience working with Councillor Yvette at the Angie Brooks Center. Without further ado, she is the coordinator of this influential center based in Liberia, Angie Brooks International Center for Women's Empowerment, Leadership Development, International Peace and Security. As an advocate and champion of women's rights and gender equality, she's best known for initiating the Women's Situation Room, which I'm sure she'll speak to in one form or the other in the course of our discussion for the Liberian elections in 2011. This enables peaceful democratic elections led by empowered women through a structure of volunteers, a call center, a team of eminent women leaders, and a pool of experts across the country. Since then, the WSR has been successfully replicated in 7 countries across Africa, which actually this is a mark of a successful initiative. She received her Juris Doctorate Law degree with honors from the North Carolina Central University School of Law and serves on many US and Liberian boards, including the United States Supreme Court Bar, the US Federal District Bar, and the Association of Female Lawyers, AFL. I've known of that association for a long time, and it's good to see that it continues to be active. But last but certainly not least, Major General Prince Charles Johnson III is an infantry officer in the Armed Forces of Liberia who has served his country for over 14 years and is currently serving as Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Liberia. General Johnson has attended several military schools, including the US Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, USA, Infantry Mechanized Company Commander Course, which is the MCCC in China, Junior Staff Course, and a whole range of other courses, including in my own country, Nigeria, the Nigerian Army School of Infantry in Jaji, Kaduna. Major General Johnson holds a Master of Arts degree in Peace Studies from the Kofi Annan Institute for Conflict Transformation in Ghana, KICT, in Liberia. Postgraduate, I should know better because we were there at the founding of KICT in Liberia. Apologies for that. Postgraduate certificate in public sector management from the Institute for Public Administration and Management, University of Sierra Leone. He's well decorated in so many ways. I would count maybe one more thing so that I don't just keep reading at you, that he has completed the Harvard Kennedy School Executive Education for Senior Executives in National and International Security. And I want to say that it's a great pleasure to have the panel here. I wanted to get that out of the way so that I do that introduction before we begin our conversation in earnest. And in beginning that conversation though, we will not be going in the order in which I have introduced our panelists. We will speak first to the questions of security and safety. And I will call on General Prince Johnson to start us off. What I would like us to do here, having seen the data that the Mo Ibrahim Foundation has presented to us, I think it's important to think around the question of security, safety, justice, rule of law across the board, and think deeply about what separates what we see in terms of the scores, or what brings it nearer to reality. because sometimes you see the concept, the policy and strategy sitting on one side, but the practice and the experience of security and justice then varies widely across societies. And I think that is partly what the data that we have seen is speaking to when we talk about the kinds of gaps we have seen in the last decade. I am really looking forward to this conversation, and I want to call on you, please, General Prince Johnson, to tell us from your experience, how do you relate to the data that you have seen? If you can give us one or two observations from your experience, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Let me continue by saying, indeed, we are grateful by the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Center for Women and Development for giving us this opportunity. And today, like the moderator said, my focus will be on security and safety. As we just all listened to the statistics given from Mo Ibrahim, I would like to go back and just give a little summary to know exactly where we're from in Liberia. Overall, like Camilla said, Liberia scored 47.9 and ranked 27 out of 54 countries, and trending in a color code in pink. That is slightly, like she said, 2016, and we started to go down. But if you consider all 4 of the pillars for which the Mo Ibrahim is using, our focus is on security and safety, and security and safety also scored, according to the 2019, 54.9 over 100%, and ranked 22 over 54 countries, and scoring +2 at the same time. Our era in which we're about to address security and safety, which is one of those underlying subcategories from security and the rule of law, Liberia scored 86.7 and is ranked 13 from 54 countries, trending at 1.8, with color code green or light green, meaning progress over the last 10 years with the rate of improvement slowing over the last 5 years. Exactly as Camilla Inek said, Liberia have started to slip since 2017 down. But let us first consider what are the risks and what is associated with this high mark that we have. So in order to move to this, you will understand that, let's look at the national approach and the sub-regional approaches that we have. So internationally, Liberia is currently involved into the issue of MINUSMA, that is our commitment to stop terrorism that is in the Sahel from coming down, and also to look at the fact that Liberia is also contributing to the ECOWAS standby force, which is the regional approach, that today Liberia can simply say that, yes, we are moving this far. Let's come down to and see our bilateral engagement that we have started to, that today we are scoring high mark when it comes to security and safety. So considering the issue of security and safety, you will understand that Liberia have the policy taken is to get into a memorandum of understanding with our neighboring countries. 30 years ago, we had this situation where Liberia and other countries were so suspicious of each other. We saw, like during our civil war, according to the TRC report, we had like close to 28 warring factions, and almost 50% of the warring faction used these neighboring countries to launch their own incursion into Liberia. Today, what we have done not to have that is the issue to sign this memorandum of understanding. Liberia now have a memorandum of understanding that both militaries can conduct joint bordering patrols along the border. That reduces that suspicion of what we have. We have also included the fact that we have liaison officers that are working in our own headquarters. So we conduct joint training, and we are together with that coordination, with that 30 years thing where we have also agreed that we will not use any of our territory as a means to destabilize another country. That is very key to state during this discussion. So, like I said, what are the policies today? If you come down and look at just one of the 5 indicators that said arms, the absence of arms conflict, Liberia is ranked #1, meaning Liberia score 100% according to these statistics that have been provided. But we cannot just sit and say, yes, we have achieved this. What we need to do is to continue this engagement with our neighbors based on what we experience, that our land will not be used, to also continue the issue of our international engagement that we have with MINUSMA, looking at the spread of terrorism. But something to consider that is one of the indicators in which we score like around 92%, that is the issue of absence of conflict against civilians. If not careful, we may continue to slip down. And in order for us to work to go back up like we had between 2015 and 16, we need to see how best we can address this issue of the militarization of our young people, meaning we're about to approach elections. The need to see how best we can cooperate, work together. And what we are doing is to engage, not necessarily security going against the issue of security going against civilians, but the issue of various rival groups going against each other. We have, like, we consider the 2 biggest, the CDC and the COP. These are groups that, CPP, excuse me, that we expect that during the election, if we don't engage these political leaders to look into the issue of how they are demilitarizing the group, it's going to be a big challenge for us. So one thing, like, I will want to now summarize, like I just said, yes, indeed, on safety, security and safety, Liberia got hard mark. But to sustain that and continue to move to do better, like I just explained first, is to see how best we can continue with our own engagement, that we have regional engagement, not to allow terrorism to be able to come down for security and safety of our country. We know it across the Sahel, it's in Mali. And I also explained about our memorandum of understanding that we have considering our neighboring countries, like 30 years, the lesson learned from there, that they should not be repeated, that we have these memorandum of understanding where we conduct joint training. I just also explained, and I also want to add, it's not because of all these policies that today we have. I want to commend and give credit to the Liberian people. Majority of the Liberian people have decided that they want peace. I would think that that also have added to what we have in place, like I just explained. So to close, I want to say I'm from an organization, the Armed Forces of Liberia. We were considered as the 7th worst atrocity committed during our Civil War, but we have transitioned from that position to see how best today we are considered a peacekeeper in stopping the flow of terrorism and not to reach to Liberia, but we have to be mindful to see how best we can continue this process. So I will stop there and say thank you and wait for any questions or answers. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Major General Prince Johnson. Succinct. You engaged the data in precisely how I had hoped that you would. Then you came back to really talk about sustaining this. So all of those points that you have made, they're well taken, and we'll return to them in discussion time. But I just want to stress that you have talked about the question of interdisciplinary work indirectly. Without further ado, I want to move to Councillor Yvette Chesson-Wureh. Over to you now for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for inviting the Angie Brooks International Center to speak on the issues of security and safety, looking at the IIAG for Liberia. I'm going to be very brief and will address what civil society sees as Liberia's greatest threats to security, justice, and peace, based on one APEX talking bus, which engages citizens to identify issues arising in their communities. And having implemented this in more than half of our counties, we identified the lack of economic opportunities. As a result, we have disadvantaged youth, whom we call Zogos or Zogis, heavily addicted, and the majority of them believe They have nothing to lose. They are living in our graveyards and other places and engaging in criminal activities to sustain themselves. Thus, arming them is relatively easy. We at IIAG have piloted a program where we challenge these youth to create their own jobs by first teaching them entrepreneurial skills, then have them implement those skills by competing with similarly situated youth to gain initial funding for their businesses. Looking at the index, we see that Liberia has a plus 15.9 under the category of absence of forced migration. I don't know the index definition of forced migration here, but certainly the lack of employment opportunities has forced our youth to migrate to Monrovia and other Liberian cities from farmlands and rural Liberia looking for jobs. Many have even left Liberia. Another one is the infusion of illegal drugs in our communities, and this is on the increase. Our rural communities are now naming it as the #1 contributor to crime. Community leaders do not know how to combat this new scourge. The youth are becoming addicted and the future looks bleak. It has penetrated our rural areas. The drug addictive youth have become terrorists in their own communities, especially those that sell drugs. Police presence in our rural areas is scarce, non-existent, and ill-equipped. Absence of criminality is also in the index at 80.9. Again, our concern. Domestic violence and rape are also on the increase. Victims are still largely addressed by the informal system of justice or by chiefs. Rape victims continue to be denied access to our court system due to lack of courts in Liberia. Again, the IIAG has as absence of violence against children at 92.6. We have a lot of children being raped. How was this high mark achieved? Land grabbing is a major threat to security. This is being done throughout Liberia, and land disputes are not being resolved adequately. Our courts are overburdened with cases, and the other means of resolution are inadequate to handle this problem. Whether it is individuals who just occupy land without permission or documentation, or concessions whom communities believe did not adhere to the accession agreement, and because of corruption, the Liberian authorities are not penalizing the concessions, land grabbing is threatening to be the cause of Liberia's next war. High rate of corruption with impunity, this is being dealt with by another panelist. Our war crimes court discussions, where we have former warlords threatening that there are armed men in the bushes being trained, and if such a court were established, they are ready to go to war. This is causing people to feel unsafe as they have not had a robust response from the government of Liberia deterring such an action. Witchcraft and ritual killings. As we approach elections in 2023, these are feared to be on the increase. Tribal violence. We have seen the ugliness of this recently in Nimba County, but it's also brewing in other counties. This also has its roots in land grabbing and lack of economic opportunities. I'm going to explain why women are so integral to ensuring peace and security, because they and their children are the biggest victims. Women have more to lose and are best equipped. The Women's Situation Room, which is a process in which women take over their countries during elections to prevent violence before, during, and after elections, has proven that having women participate in the implementation and stabilization of peace in a country is essential. Women are natural peacemakers. They do this in their households. Additionally, to protect their families, women have their ears to the ground and intervene in many matters to deflate them before they become major issues. Women look at things differently than men. Even men recognize that, because when meeting with village elders, usually men, about serious matters affecting the village, the chief will ask you to sleep over because, quote, the morning brings answers, unquote. That night, they will consult with the women and give you your answer in the morning. Liberia has proven that female leadership is different and superior. Starting with Chief Swakoko, it was a woman who consolidated our borders. It was a woman, Ruth Sander Perry, who transitioned Liberia from a post-war society to having democratic elections. It was a woman, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who establish a democratic government and had to deal with the crushing priorities for reconstruction. All of these women led Liberia at pivotal periods of our history. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I think you have taken us to a space where we can directly connect your presentation with Major General Johnson's. He warned us that sustainability was a question. And I believe Camilla's presentation already also talked about the question of inclusion, and you're beginning to take us to the questions of participation and inclusion. Without wanting to be a boring academic, we know that the foundations of peace really speak to the questions of structural violence. And so if we're witnessing the successes that have been fought hard for, which General Johnson was talking about, what I'm hearing is that in practice, or the experience of security, dare I say justice, because we're talking about that continuum here, is not quite as it ought to be, which might explain some of those, or some of the data we're seeing on questions of inclusion. And I think you've laid bare that issue here. We're going to have a bit of time to discuss this. I'm not sure whether Justice Scott is here because I know she was having problems connecting. I'm just really checking my notes. I don't think so. Justice Scott, if you are online, please turn on your camera. I don't think she's here yet. So I'm going to go to the next panelist. I was going to do that in a different order because I wanted to bring the questions of justice to the center of the conversation that we're having. But let me go to Dean Warner. I know that you also well experienced on questions of justice and accountability. So please, over to you. Please give us your own take on this.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation extended me. I think it's also good that I'm speaking before the Chief Justice so that she can have chance to comment on a few observations that I have, which relate in part to justice sector and the rule of law. But let me begin briefly by saying that as a Liberian, I'm quite happy as to the score that Liberia got on the index. I cannot speak to the details that have been provided, but I think the score and the ranking appear quite reasonable. I am curious though, that while accountability and transparency got a fairly high score, anti-corruption was projected to be one of the worst. Here are my two or three key observations, and I'm making them as an outline so that hopefully during question and answer, we can have maybe more points about them. My first observation is, and this is against the background of personal involvement, experiences, and daily engagement with the justice sector, anti-corruption efforts, and campaign to ensure transparency and accountability. Against those backgrounds, I make the one key point that notwithstanding the sort of mark that we see for accountability and transparency, in my impression, what you consider to be the improved accountability and transparency in Liberia is more symbolic and quite peripheral than substantive. And I think that the lack of accountability and transparency accounts for the poor score and effort in combating corruption and good governance. And I will just cite three quick points to prove that, and I will end. One has to do with lack of accountability and transparency in the judicial sector which is judicial accountability. Liberian law provides that cases that are filed should be docketed in the order of filing. That should not be so surprising, and that is in the statute. But for decades, before 2000, before 2010, up to this date, cases that are filed are not docketed in number. And so that a person who had a case filed in 2008 may not have it hurried compared to a person who filed it just yesterday. And what lawyers do, and that's what I said, the Chief Justice and all of mine have a take, is basically to go and appeal to judges to assign cases. That is probably one of the worst forms of lack of judicial accountability. And that should undermine any performance on a judicial scale. That you go, you never know when your case will be heard. It depends on who comes first. I can elaborate on that at some point. The second point has to do with, again, lack of accountability and transparency in the fight against corruption. Let's take the case of the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct provided for an ombudsman. That ombudsman office has been designed and deliberately structured not to be effective. A key component under the Code of Conduct was declaration of assets. I would suggest that everybody knows one of the key reasons for declaration of assets, not only to combat corruption, but to enable society to participate in fighting corruption, especially illicit enrichment. But again, from 2014, when the law was passed, up to now, all the declarations are held in secret. There is not much available for society to know so as to be able to help in the fight. I mean, arguments have been made as to personal privacy, but the least civil society and other expected will be either to have a summary report, a redacted report, or just a net worth, a statement of net worth of those taking office, so that we have a fair appreciation. But in the absence of that, how do we deal with question of illicit enrichment? How do we even engage with that? The last point, again, for lack of transparency and accountability, which I think challenge this whole notion as to absence of state capture, relates also to the failure to enforce statutory laws about campaign financing, limit on campaign financing, who may contribute. Our laws are clear. Limits for campaigning will be 2 million for president, 600 for lawmakers. Those are not enforced. Those candidates have to be able to do regular reporting. There's no enforcement. Those reportings are not available. And so in summary, I'm not surprised that anti-corruption is worst performing, but my explanation is this is due in large part to lack of transparency, lack of accountability, both in the judicial sector, in the executive sector, and in almost all sectors. I will pause there and see how we can give time. So, thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. We already have the basis for really, really robust conversation. And now, you know, I'm going to pose a combination of questions, my own questions to you, and I would only have maybe one question that, you know, I hope that you can respond to along with the other questions that I will field from the audience. But just to say what my observation of this is, I was alluding to that in my brief comments in between. But first and foremost, Dean Warner, you called a spade a spade. You have problematized, you know, the challenge, you know, you problematized the whole question of why we use indices. All right, so, and some people will tell you this kind of bean counting quantitative work doesn't, you know, allow you to see the translation of that concept into any kind of practice or experience. And you have hit that nail on the head. First and foremost, I think it's fair to say that what we've seen with the Mo Ibrahim Index in the past few years is it tends to give us, if you like, a sense of the direction of travel So you can see that direction. You can see when a country seems to be moving in the right direction because some of those indices are going, you can begin to see them being fulfilled somewhat. They're telling us that progress is being made. And they also help us, in a sense, segment areas where we think we're doing well or not so well. That's number one. Number two, when we then come really directly to the question of security, safety, justice, and the rule of law, I just want to spell that out. That itself is an interdisciplinary area where you can see that if we do the hard security things, the absence of conflict, of armed conflict, the absence of Liberia being a haven for terrorism, all of those things that Major General Johnson spoke about, it still does not tell us what happens in practice to the individual, how the individual experiences security or insecurity, if you like, or justice, or the absence of it. And you've just laid that out. But I think third, the index itself, because it has to segment, then leaves us to do the analysis for ourselves that you've just done. Actually, that you've all just done in a sense, to say, if we're high in these areas, if we've scored highly on accountability and transparency, why would we score low? All right, when it comes to corruption issues, what is it that defines that intersection that makes us see a variation in those two areas? And we may have time for the Mo Ibrahim people to come back or not. I'm just laying that on the table. But finally, what matters most is what happens to ordinary Liberians, men, women, young, old, in terms of how they experience the state and how they experience these questions of security and justice. And I want to thank the three of you for doing an excellent job in that area. But I want to field some questions which might not be enabled, but I'll just really say maybe the order in which we'll have it. Let me first list those questions so that you note the questions to yourselves, and I will call you in turn, please, to answer. So someone is asking already, what specifically is responsible for Liberia's decline in the anti-corruption index? I think, Dinwana, you've already, it's as if you preempted that question. But if others want to add a thing or two to the brilliant presentation you've just done on this question, then let's do that. Another one is, what is the role of the police in maintaining the rule of law? So, and this is where I want to push everyone to please think about this foundation of peace issue, because security is the other side of the coin of peace. If we're going to have durable peace, and General Warner's, Warner, as well as General Johnson's presentations are warning us of the kinds of things that we need to look out for. I believe Councillor Yvette as well. This question, which is not my question, is a question that was laid bare by the founder, by the godfather of peace studies, Johan Galtung. The idea of equal life chances. To what degree do you think Liberia is taking seriously the question of providing equal life chances for citizens in a way that we can move towards? It's a journey towards peace, security, justice, and the rule of law. The rule of law itself is an instrument, but that movement towards peace, security, and justice, please comment broadly on it. Councillor Wureh says there's no, that migration says something else in migration, the index says something else on migration, but we on forced migration, but internally, we see that, forced movement of another sort. Is it how we define it? And that's for Mo Ibrahim Foundation people. The last question that I want you to please consider, how ready are the army and police to protect citizens during elections? I chose that in particular because I think General Johnson, that dimension, who protects whom during elections? Is that the army? Does the army come out during elections? Isn't that already a sign of something? if the army comes out. But how do you envision that relationship between police protection during elections and the role of the armed forces of Liberia? I think I would leave that there. There's a question for the Chief Justice. I haven't seen her come on, so I'm going to, I think that's already been preempted as well. Let me leave that and then ask that first and foremost, let's hear from you very, very briefly, Councillor Yvette, on this question of equal life chances and what you're saying about women and girls and the forced migration. Do you think the index should think about forced migration differently?
Most certainly, thank you. Yes, I definitely think it should think of it differently when you're looking at countries like Liberia and countries in Africa, when we're seeing so many of our youth taking that perilous journey across the Mediterranean, trying to go to, first of all, going to North Africa and then trying to cross into Europe. We are seeing this increasingly and it's becoming problematic. It's something that has been even discussed at the African Union. I think we have to be realist about forced migration and what constitutes forced migration. And the lack of economic opportunities definitely for us is a means of forced migration. Why the youth get up and leave the country and they're forced to do so. So yes, I think that has to happen. And really would like Mo Abraham to look at that. And then the equal life chances for citizens. Liberia is moving towards that, but we're going very slowly. One of the things that's happening right now, and I have researchers on the ground because of the type of work that the Angie Brooks situation, the Angie Brooks International Center does, especially with the situation in Rome. We have ongoing projects on the ground that's dealing with how citizens looking at things in view of the fact that we're about to go into elections. And one of the things that we're making sure about is that citizens understand what are their issues. They must define their issues before politicians come, and therefore they must be able to learn how to engage politicians and not just sit there and be somebody that politicians talk to, but to engage them as to what the real issues are and what they would like to see as solutions. Because of this, we've been able to find out quite a bit about the issues that are actually on the ground surrounding these things. And women are feeling very insecure. Women are feeling right now that they're going backwards, that they're not going forward. First of all, we've lost representation in our legislature. Again, that is problematic. They're not seeing women stepping forth like they expect, and they're hoping, and everyone is trying right now to gather women to step forth for political representation. But they're also seeing that women have become more reclining in these recent days. I must go back to the matter of how women see things differently, and I'll give you a very short example. During our war in Liberia, as the women were sitting at the table with the warlords and having discussions about the cutting up of Monrovia. At the time, the warlords were deciding how to cut up Monrovia. And this warlord is saying, oh, I want from Gurley Street to this street, I want this section. You know what the women asked? The women asked, where are the social services? Where are the markets? Where are the churches? Where are the schools? How do we get from one faction to the next faction? What happens if we got to get water? You know, those kind of questions arose. And because of that, they had to rethink the carving up of Monrovia. So just to say that women at the table is essential for peace. Women at the table is essential for holistically looking at things. Thank you. I know I've overstepped my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I understand that Justice Scott is here, but before I just want to now direct specific questions to her because we're now in discussion mode. But General Johnson, can you respond please on that question of the police and the armed forces, particularly when it comes to citizens' protection during election?
So, thank you, Madam Moderator. When it comes to election, how ready is the military or the police role? Actually, there's a system we have in place that we call in Liberia the National Security Council. That is chaired by the president. In that council, the next level is the Joint Security, where you have that is chaired by the Minister of Justice. And there you find the military and all paramilitary represented in that Joint Security Council. At another operational level, you have the police. So the military will not get on, especially during the elections. We always stay in our barracks. We only monitor what is happening. And the only time the military comes in is when the police is overwhelmed, cannot no longer handle the situation. So most time we sit with them in joint planning. We understand how they are deployed strategically for elections, but we don't interfere unless they are overwhelmed. I know Liberians are used to it, and that's why this leadership under the military have always considered what had happened in the past and how we can move forward. If you read the TRC report on Liberia, the first thing the military violated the issue of democracy by jumping in 1980 by a military coup. We have know that to understand our own line of demarcation on how can we get involved. Another issue is that we have always seen in the past where our post-stacking was always used as a means to keep political surveillance, political leaders there. And that, according to the Constitution, we cannot host or have somebody in prison under the military, especially when that person is a civilian. Another issue is the issue that we were always called by power that be to quarrel demonstration. Example, in the 80s, like the University of Liberia, every time there was a student violation or protest, the military will always call and jump in the police. What is very important now is that risk of our own leadership to inform the commander-in-chief that whatever situation that is happening, to advising when do we come in. That is why under this new dispensation, you don't see the military come in when it's come to protest unless the police is overwhelming. Even if we are coming in, we will come as a professional to know how to handle the situation and be able to move forward. So let us lay the fear that the repeat that we used to have. That is why we lay the basis on why security and safety is that way. So to conclude, I just want to tell that person that asked that question that we will only come in if the police is overwhelmed. And we had a situation, this gone by election last year in the Cape Mount area. That was the only area where we had to come out and support the police. Even we came out without anybody saying no, but we were there to provide security and serve the Liberian people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really, really useful. General, before I leave you alone for some time, can you respond to this question of, and I think you've already responded, we know the armed forces are not the first port of call. You're there to support, if ever needed. The role of women in the armed forces, though, I'm quite intrigued by that as well. Can you give me a sense of the representation of women in the armed forces and whether you see women in the armed forces as perhaps the first layer of that support if there were questions of women being in danger during such moments?
Well, I would tell you, for the armed forces of Liberia, we can even boast and say it's an achievement that sooner or later you may have the first female chief of staff, even in West Africa and most likely Africa as a whole. My deputy is a Brigadier General George, and today she went through the fire. She's my classmate, and she went through the fire to ascend to that position. Currently, in the armed forces of Liberia, we are just under 4%. In 2008, we were as far as 8%. What we did, we conducted our research to find out why we have the issue of attrition of a lot of women going from 8% and we reduced to 4%. In order to work that out, we have already started through the ELIS Fund, that is the United Nations Women Organization, have provided funding where we have started the issue of our gender policy to be we are very gender sensitive, and we are looking towards at the completion of that policy and the survey with the Cornell University from the US and the AFL, we're trying to identify why. Some would say it's a cultural thing, that in Liberia, people believe the military is all male. And our next recruitment drive, as we hoping to get budgetary support, budgetary appropriation, the next recruit of 350, we want to balance that at least to get 50%. But again, that left for seeing those interested. And I know we're going to see how best to talk to a lot of the women groups to encourage more women. And we're going to even use our Deputy Chief of Staff, Brigadier General George, to be able to lead that campaign and encourage more women to come. But our role, we are very gender sensitive. We don't look down on women. We see everybody as either soldier, a sailor, or airman. So I hope I answered that question well. But currently, we do have a Deputy Chief of Staff, and it shows how much that we don't pick and choose, but we are very gender sensitive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can already tell my bias in some of these questions that I imagine, but you know, for those who are aware that much of my work in the early to mid stages of my career was on questions of security and armed forces in Liberia. So I don't even have to read the Mo Ibrahim Index. I see the progress that is being made in that area. So I want to thank you very much. Dean Warner, last but not least, I realized that Justice Scott is still having challenges logging on. So I'm sorry if I'm coming to you full steam on the questions around you know, accountability and transparency and rule of law questions. I'm struck by some of the questions that come in. For example, Dean Warner, this is you. You touched on the lack of transparency and accountability in the executive as well. In the executive as well. What is the role of integrity in institutions in ensuring that state leaders act in accordance with the legislation? And I have, there's yet another one. I've seen a trend like that talks specifically on this question of transparency and accountability. And you link this rightly. And for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, what we're struck by is that there's a high, there's a high score for transparency and accountability, but a very low score for corruption. You know, why is that? Why is that the case? But Dean Warner, can you just please speak to this question, these two things? Some people are saying, shouldn't it start from the top? How can you really get how can you deal with corruption? And how can you really secure any high score in transparency and accountability issues if you don't deal with this right from the top? The judicial sector is being singled out here in some of the things that I'm receiving. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And let me begin with judicial accountability. I will then go to talk about the integrity institution, Anti-Corruption Commission, the Ombudsman established, and a few more, and I'll be brief. But I want to suggest that the judiciary is obviously critical to our governance and to everything we're discussing, including accountability. And so here's the way that I want you to, one of the key points to take away. Let's imagine that, and this is not accountability that you are addressing and transparency. We should make a distinction between access to court and access to justice. There are many reasons, from finance, structural issue, adequate or inadequate laws that may hinder people to reach the court. So in our setting, finding chance to enter the court is almost like trying to travel from hell to heaven, for lack of better comparison. But let's imagine also that you travel from hell and you reach heaven. And that is almost like coming from having no access to court until you enter the temple of justice, where justice should be served. And you have it that heaven gives you no relief, or maybe even treats you worse than hell. That is what judicial accountability presents. If you travel and you overcame all the obstacles to access court, and you came to court and you are there over a decade with no relief, or you are dealt with under circumstances that create apprehension of them being fairly treated, it's like you reach the temple where you should have gotten all the relief, and the temple of justice has run dry with justice. And the way we say that accountability plays its part is this. Just one take for you to be. If we had a system where everybody who enters the temple of justice is given a little pass that we do in banks, in telco companies, you go, you get number 2, number 3, number 4. So Mana Salif Johnson is number 5. And you from West Point, you're number 1. And you have to be heard before her. And President Weah is number 20. You will be surprised how these questions about accountability, this question about us not having appellate court will be resolved, and how we all would join to say, you know what? Cases take too long in the judiciary, let's work on it. And for those who may still have difficulties in their knowledge because I'm summarizing it, just think about what we do in the traffic. We do not stand any good chance of having our roads improved when these things, powerful and rich, will not be in queue and will just pass through on any rule because they go fast track. So that is about accountability. The judiciary is key. It's key. It must ensure that everyone is treated fairly. And that is why it is a problem. And one of the ways that should be done, we can talk about the quality of the rulings and everything, but it's just process. Let's be sure that when you call a case, you call it because it was first, that level of accountability. Quickly, other examples you will give will be in terms of the code of conduct. There was good reason why the code of conduct provided for an administrative body or office that will hear complaints against public officials without necessarily going to court. That's administrative justice. That's a key integrity institution. The way you should think about it is that, where is that body? If anybody employs someone based on maybe tribalism or party affiliation at my exclusion, how do I file a complaint? I go to court and spend 3 years? That ombudsman office is an integrity institution. Let's go to about anti-corruption commissions as you see them. These are commissions that go for about 5 years, 6 years without being fully structured, without being funded. So these integrity institutions do play a role. You want to ask to say, what is the General Auditing Commission? To what extent does it audit the legislature? To what extent does it audit the executive? And to what extent are these audit reports available? This is a trend analysis, so it's not good to talk about topical issue, but it is still relevant for example's sake to say the legislature have given themselves $30,000. They say it's not for themselves. To what extent are we assured that that will be audited and accounted for? You and myself as individual cannot go, but the Anti-Corruption Commission has a responsibility, no hindrance, to launch investigation into this matter. So there's a role for this integrity institution. And on that count, I should let you know that Election Commission is also an integrity institution. And the point I was making is, if you allow politicians to run for office without any sense of accountability on limits on campaign financing, it means you allow them to flout the law to run for office. They get in office, they flout the law to serve themselves. They leave office flouting the law to do it. We are in a very, very difficult situation. So there's a role for the integrity institution. There's a role for established branches of government. There's a role for civil society, and there's a role for you and myself.
Thank you so much. I think it's so well said. There's so many questions coming in, but I can tell you, I cannot, I don't think we have time to respond to all the questions, but the statements about systemic injustice of the poor and underprivileged almost therefore mirrors your heaven and hell, your hell to heaven story. I'm back to hell, as it were. By the way, we're saying all of this, but in terms of the direction of travel, Liberia is far ahead of so many other African countries, which makes me worry about the state of the continent, but also says a lot about how far you have come, how far we have come in Liberia. Without further ado, what I'd like to do, and I want to say thank you to all the people that have been fielding the questions. The question of what role can lawyers play in Liberia to help mitigate some of the challenges mentioned by Dean Warner. And I think there's one in particular I just want to flag, which I'm going to ask Camilla to take 2 minutes. I want to start wrapping up in about 5 minutes time. And I still want each speaker, each of the three panelists to give us 30-second soundbite. If you want us to go with anything here today, what is it that you want us to take away? So Camilla, it says the low scores and or rates of change in the subcategory of the MIF indices in the areas of public procurement, procedures, law enforcement, disclosure of financial and judicial information, accessibility of information seems concerning. Anyway, it's not for you to answer. It's asking panelists to reflect on the sphere of expertise, what improvements can be made to make a monumental change in both Liberia's absolute scores and rates of change in these areas. Don't answer that. Reflect on it, because I think subsequent panels might still be able to take up something like this. But what I would like you to please reflect on in 2 minutes, please, Camilla, is why are these variations there? When on the one hand, we have low scores for inclusion, and on the other hand, high scores for transparency and accountability, and of course, low scores for what did we say, for corruption, for example. But the forced migration issue, what were you looking at? I would imagine due to armed conflict. I think I already have the answer, but if you can explain to our listeners just a little bit about why some scores are high and some corresponding areas are low. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you so much for your question. I don't know if 2 minutes are enough for this, but let us start with the question about the migration measures and why they do not reflect the sort of youth and economic opportunity elements that have been raised. The question is quite easy in the sense that what we call migration measures the presence of IDPs, internally displaced persons within the country, and the share of migrants fleeing the country due to conflict mainly. And that is why these are clustered under the security and rule of law category. So here it is mostly looking at the conflict drivers of migration. And that is why here we have relatively higher scores, because this reflects the relatively stable conflict situation of Liberia. As concerns certainly the very good points made about the challenge of youth and how to address the needs of youth, I would say this is something that will certainly emerge in further panels as well, because it is also a driver that we can see manifested across the whole continent, because as I said, one of the strengths of the index is that we can run comparisons and parallels across the 54 African countries, and the need to address, for instance, the socioeconomic integration of youth and economic opportunities for youth, which, by the way, it's representing now, it will continue to represent for a few years to go, the majority of Africa's population. So it's not really like a constituency that can be neglected. All these issues will be dealt within the Foundation for Economic Opportunity category discussion. So I invite you also to follow these. When it comes to anti-corruption and the drivers of change there, I would say, first of all, let us remember what Ines said in her presentation. This is a concerning story, but it's a concerning story that has happened rather recently, because until 2015, Liberia was ranking among the 10 best African countries in this category. So I think here the narrative should really be, there doesn't need to be any huge change, but rather a sustained engagement to bring back the country where it was. Because it's really alarming, the fact that there has been a jump of almost 30 ranks position within such a short period of time. I would invite Ines, if you allow me, to sort of unpack a little bit more the very interesting question about the sort of inconsistency between the results for anti-corruption and the results for accountability and transparency, because I think it's quite interesting. And she can explain also what constitutes the sort of drivers of change within anti-corruption. Ines?
Yeah, I can actually do it very shortly because actually I think Dean Warner explained it fairly well. We see a lot of the things that he explained actually in our data. So if we look at it, we see, for example, one of the main drivers we see that has declined between 2015 and 2019 is, for example, the anti-corruption mechanisms. So the issue of maybe these institutions not being funded enough, not functioning well enough. Another main point that has been raised by Dean Warner as well is if we go into the accountability and transparency subcategory, we also see there's different measures here. So some of them refer more to accountability, others more to transparency, in the sense that some of them look at like specific like access to information present, etc. So if we look at which kind of indicators have driven the change here, we see it is things like the absence of undue influence on governments, which is a very broad indicator that measures kind of the influence of kind of outside of groups, it's outside government. But what is quite striking is that the only indicator which hasn't improved is institutional checks and balances. So there seems to be a lack of kind of checks and balances from the institutional side of things that then could potentially kind of say that this discrepancy that seems to be there superficially between accountability and transparency and anti-corruption is maybe not as substantial as it might seem at the beginning, because we do see declining institutional checks and balances in Liberia. And then again, indicators like accessibility to information, they are still scoring fairly low. And we see this across the continent, not only in Liberia. So accessibility of information has about a score of just under 40. So it's not particularly scoring very highly. So there's still plenty of work to do there as well. Although there has been progress since 2010, there's still plenty of work to do. So if we look at that, the relationships becomes a bit clearer, because we do have seen anti-corruption mechanisms kind of declining, but we also see institutional checks and balances at the same time declining as well, especially since 2015. And then also we see all kinds of sorts of corruption seeming to become more prevalent in the country. Especially it seems that private sector corruption, which is kind of illegal bribes paid by firms, etc. That is one of the ones that has declined the most.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, sorry, I don't want to talk anymore.
No, thank you.
But no, I think that kind of wraps it up very nicely.
All right. No, that's really very useful. And I think I wanted a chance, I wanted to give people a chance to hear that, to see what's going on there. I promised to deliver this by 1:30. And so I'm just asking our speakers, give me one sentence or even a few words that you want us to remember after this session. Councillor Yvette, I'll start with you. What is your sentence?
Okay, I want to take away that when it comes to having a war president, Liberia doesn't have one. However, Liberia is still a fragile state. And when it comes to peace and security, women must be a part of security and safety mechanisms, not only as officers, as General Johnson has pointed out, but even as civil society women, including informal mechanisms like the Women's Situation Room and our peace huts. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. General Johnson, what is your message for us to take away?
I would say thank you, and I would say it's not this policy of the MOU we have with our countries, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Ivory Coast, or what we're doing in the Sahel Basin, but it's all dependent on the Liberian people who want peace, that today Liberia is scoring on security and safety to be that high. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Last but not least, Dean Warner, what is your sentence, takeaway sentence, please?
That accountability and transparency are the surest foundation for good governance, and the extent to which we build and enforce accountability and transparency mechanism well defined and should be our focus in evaluating our governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to follow the example of the speakers by giving you my own takeaway sentence. the sustainability of security, safety, justice, and the rule of law depends on leaders and the exercise of leadership in combination with the people, in partnership with the people over a long, consistent future. Thank you so very much. I want to thank Dr. Ophelia Weeks. I want to thank Onyeka, but all our listeners, as well as our panelists, Councillor Cooper, thank you to you. Mo Ibrahim Foundation colleagues, thank you for this opportunity to do this. I appreciate it. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Professor Olonisakin, for delivering on time as promised, and also for the very insightful conversations that have been held. What I liked about this, in particular, if I may, is that not only was it analytical in terms of a review of the IIAG, but also it offers solutions and recommendations on how to address some of the problems that might initially appear to be systemic, but it offers hope because there are practical solutions to the problems that have been analyzed and have been presented. So let me join you, Professor, in thanking General Johnson and thanking Councillor Chesson-Wureh and thanking Dean Warner, Councillor Dean Warner, for an excellent presentation and discussion. We'll recess right now until 1 o'clock GMT, Monrovia time, when we'll resume, because it's an appropriate segue into our next session, which will deal with matters pertaining to participation, rights, and inclusion. So thank you, everyone. We'll take a break for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
All right.